I'm masking out light areas. I'm also going to spatter the masking fluid to create sort of light spots as well. I'm allowing the masking fluid to dry naturally. I'm mixing up my favourite colour, buff titanium, with ultramarine. For my second colour, I've just added a touch of that colour and some more water to make it lighter, and I'm putting a pinch of burnt sienna in there, so it's a really light neutral brown. I'm painting wet on dry with my size 8 mop brush. I'm painting the light area of the stone first, dropping in that sort of more blue-grey colour towards the bottom. Make sure you have plenty of paint loaded on your brush. It gives you more time. I rinse my brush there. I'm going to take off the excess water off my brush with my paper towel and lift off the paint on the right hand side at the top where there is light. So you've got soft sort of muted colours to the left, and the light source is coming from the right. So everything on the right hand side of the stones will be lighter. So I'm mixing up the ultramarine here with the burnt sienna. You'll notice it isn't a puddle, so I'm actually using the flat part of the palette. And I took the excess paint off on my paper towel. I'm painting damp into damp here with the size 8 brush on the left hand side where there is a shadow. By painting damp into damp, you get a lovely soft edge, as you can see there, which is quite a nice way of painting shadows on rounded objects. So I'm just blending here on the right hand side with a clean damp brush. I'm adding more ultramarine, and the colours that I'm using are from tube paint which I've squeezed out, so it's quite creamy this, and I'm just painting the darkest shadow on the pebble right at the bottom, damp into damp with the size 8 brush. I'm using black Brusho to sprinkle onto the wet surface. Now if you don't have Brusho, don't worry, I will have alternatives to Brusho later in this tutorial. I'm also sprinkling some salt as well onto the wet surface, and I will allow the salt to dry naturally. So I'm mixing up here a little bit of yellow with a pinch of the ultramarine and burnt sienna, really diluted, painting this middle stone so it's away from the wet top stone, so there's no bleeds, no risk of bleeding there. And I'm adding lots of water to the right hand side, a little bit more of that sort of yellow, sort of mustardy colour to the left. Adding a little bit more burnt sienna there to the ultramarine and yellow, and painting this wet into wet on the left hand side where there is a shadow. Mixing up some more ultramarine, literally straight from the tube, no hardly any water, so it's quite creamy. It's a dark brown, and I'm painting damp into damp on the left hand side and underneath, and just smoothing there with a clean damp brush. Sprinkling some of the black Brusho onto the wet surface again to create some lovely textures, and again sprinkling some salt onto the wet surface to create some light textures once dry. I'm using Daniel Smith's Mayan blue. You can use Prussian blue. I'm painting the bottom stone here, starting with the lightest side, wet on dry. Just diluted it a little bit more there. It was a bit dark. Just getting a little bit more of that Mayan blue. I've run out here at the top. Just want it a bit darker on the left-hand side. Mixing up some more Mayan blue. You can see there's less water there, thicker paint. So I'm painting damp into wet here on the left hand side where its lovely darker shadow is, still just using this one blue. I'm using some cling film here, plastic wrap, pulling it a little bit taut to create some thin lines. So you place it onto the wet surface, and you can use your fingertips to kind of maneuver the plastic wrap and allow that to dry or to set. And I'm painting wet on dry the second stone. Mixing up some cerulean now, slightly creamier, making it sort of more of an interesting colour there on the left. Sort of pushing that towards the bottom. Mixing up a pinch of Paynes grey now, making that colour darker. Lifting off a little bit more with a clean damp brush on the right hand side there to create the light. I'm using a watercolour pencil here, drawing into the wet paint to create a thin line. You can do this with your watercolours when the painting is dry later, but I thought it'd be quite nice to use a watercolour pencil to create some alternative techniques. I'm also using watercolour pencil and sandpaper. I'm rubbing the tip of the pencil against the sandpaper to allow the pigment to fall onto the wet surface, and it fixes itself there. And this is a great alternative to Brusho. I'm peeling off the plastic wrap now. It's not quite dry, but it has set, and it's created the most amazing marks. It really does look like a sort of the marks that are on stones, etc. So this I'm painting wet on dry is a little bit of yellow ochre. And I think a little bit of ultramarine got in there by accident. So I'm just using it and just blending with it as well. So not to worry. So it's a little bit cooler on the left-hand side. I didn't plan it that way, but I went with it. Just painting the shadows now using ultramarine and burnt sienna wet into wet with that size 8 brush. I'm using the watercolour pencil again with the sandpaper to sprinkle it on, the pigment on to the damp surface to create some lovely sort of textured marks. I'm also using the watercolour pencil to sort of draw into the damp surface to create some marks, and I'm sprinkling some salt on to the damp surface, and that will absorb some of the paint to create lovely light textures. I'm mixing up here some yellow raw sienna, big puddle. I'm trying to make a really sort of natural colour for the sort of foreground here. So it's a natural sort of stone colour. It's a little bit bright at the moment, so I'm going to adjust that. But I really load my brush, painting wet on dry. Again, if this is tricky for you, wet this area first and paint wet into wet. I've added some quinacridone gold to that colour, so it's a little bit darker. I'm painting that damp into damp. And I'm using the plastic wrap, and I'm placing that on top of the wet paint, manipulating it with my fingertips to create some nice sort of markings once it's dry. I painted the background in more of an abstract style using the same colours I used for the pebbles, wet into wet, and I'm actually using some plastic wrap now, putting it on top of the damp surface to create some textures. I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally. So here is the painting dry, and I must say I love the salt effect. The plastic wrap worked really well in the background just to create some sort of textures, etc. So mixing up ultramarine here with a pinch of red, a little bit more ultramarine. That red is quite strong. It's Winsor Red. So it creates a lovely sort of shadow colour, quick way of getting a shadow colour. And I'm painting very carefully, wet on dry, the cast shadow here using my size 8 brush. And I've actually got a pencil line there where the shadow comes over the left hand side of that second pebble. What I'm doing now is I'm going to rinse my brush, take off the excess water, dilute the ultramarine with a pinch of that red, working from the left hand side of the shadow, pushing it up to the darkest cast shadow area, letting it bleed in. So you get the darkest shadow part directly underneath, and I'm making it lighter as it goes away because some of the light will catch that area, so the cast shadow will be the strongest, darkest tonal value. Again, I'm going to paint the last cast shadow using the ultramarine with the red, wet on dry. If you're not getting it dark enough, add a pinch of Paynes grey. So I'm very carefully painting this darkest part of the shadow, working my way around here because it's so effective, but it's such a dark colour, so do take your time. So just working my way around, and I have got it sketched there with the pencil, so do have that there. It will give you more confidence if you've got the actual shadow drawn in. Mixing up some more of that cerulean there and painting that and pushing it into that dark shadow. So I'm kind of mixing the colours on the paper there. Remember, the light will get to the outside edge of the shadow. It will appear slightly lighter. So just sort of blending that. The dark shadow that I painted did dry off a little bit, so I'm sort of trying to blend it so it doesn't get a hard edge. This may not happen to you, but if it does, be the boss of your watercolour and just blend those colours there. Rinsing my brush there, working from the outside in, sort of diluting that colour so it's lighter on the outside edge of that cast shadow. I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. What I'm doing now is I'm rubbing off the salt and I'm removing the masking fluid with my paper towel. You can see there's some lovely white sort of spots and textures, etc. And also I use the masking fluid to mask out some of the white lines and markings on the stone. So I've mixed up some cerulean and Paynes grey. I'm painting wet on dry. And I'm just painting the shadow here on the left hand side, rinsing my brush and just softening the hard edge. Getting a little bit more of the ultramarine and red there, Winsor Red, painting wet into wet, just making that shadow a little bit darker. What I'm doing here is I'm using the Winsor Red and ultramarine and painting wet on dry around the lightest part of this pebble here. And it's to really bring out the light. And so I'm using light against dark, rinsing my brush, taking off the excess water off the side there, working from the outside in just to soften. So why I do that is so the paint runs to that sort of wet surface that I've created. I've created a large wet surface, so you get a lovely sort of seamless soft edge. So I'm mixing up some more of the Paynes grey and Cerulean and just bringing out these shadows on the left hand side. It's almost like I'm glazing them on. It's just to make them look more 3D. Rinse my brush, took the excess water off, and I'm just softening and blending the outside edge there. Adding a little bit more of the ultramarine and Winsor Red, and just painting a stronger shadow just underneath where the light source isn't getting to it there, just to really sort of make these pebbles look more 3D. More of the ultramarine Paynes grey with a pinch of the Winsor Red. I'm just kind of finessing here, just making some of the cast shadow just a bit stronger, a bit darker. So it really makes them look more 3D, and just blending and softening a lighter shadow colour to the left-hand side there. I didn't like some of the white dots there made by the masking fluid, so I've just covered them up there with that ultramarine and Winsor Red. So using more of the Cerulean and Paynes grey, I am painting here a lovely sort of shadow colour, rinsing my brush, taking off the excess water off on the side there, and just softening and blending with a clean wet brush. Rinsing my brush, taking off the excess water with a paper towel, I'm just softening that edge there, just to sort of make it look much more rounded. A little bit more of the ultramarine here with the Winsor Red, just painting this shadow. Again, you can use the Cerulean and Paynes grey, just painting it at the bottom here, wet on dry, rinsing the brush, taking off the excess water on the paper towel and blending there with a clean damp brush. What I'm doing here is I'm using the Cerulean and Paynes grey, and I just want to bring out this pebble here. It was a little bit too much light on light, so I wanted to make the sort of background colour a little bit darker to bring out the sort of positive object here. So I'm actually painting the negative space to bring out the positive shape of those pebbles. So I'm actually painting around the right hand side of pebble number 3 and 4, and again blending with a clean wet brush so you don't get any hard awkward edges. What I'm doing now is I'm going to glaze some of the background, pretty much using some of the colours in my palette, but you could use the Paynes grey with the Cerulean, or you could use ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. Mixing up some more of the Cerulean and Paynes grey and continuing on glazing the background to push it back. This brings those pebbles forward and creates the illusion of depth. So working my way carefully in the background. I've decided to glaze the foreground as well, just with that thin wash of Cerulean and Paynes grey. It's so thin, it just changes the colour slightly so it doesn't look so bright. So really carefully paint on top, so you kind of creating again that illusion of depth there. And I've decided to sprinkle some salt onto the wet paper to create some textures. And I'm removing the washi tape to reveal a white border, and it gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting. And I thought it'd be quite nice to finish off with a spatter of white gouache. So I'm just spattering on the right hand side there using the size 8 brush. And here's a close up there. I got a bit carried away, but I thoroughly enjoyed painting these pebbles. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, get access to my exclusive tutorials and my longer, more in-depth tutorials with downloadable outline sketches, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.